Howdy folks, my name is Saoirse the Vixen and welcome back to Flight Sim 2020. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at probably one of the most iconic and prolific aircraft of all time, the Boeing 747, the queen of the skies. And what better way to do that than by recreating the first ever passenger flight of this wonderful airplane. It's January 22nd, 1970, and we're here on the ramp at New York's JFK Airport in Pan American World Airways Flight 2, a Boeing 747-121 by the name of Clipper Young America. This flight was from New York to London, and though it was very, very cold at 1:45 in the morning when this flight took off, it was very clear, and evidently the atmosphere on the airplane was rather lively, shall we say. The history of this particular airplane in itself, as well as the flight and Pan American, is coming up once we get this thing started and away from the gate. So we're going to go ahead and take care of that right now, and I'll see you guys once we get in the air. Now that we're successfully on the way towards London, I figured it'd be a good time to talk a little bit about the 747 and why this particular airplane exists. Now, back in the 60s, air travel was starting to become more and more of a thing. The jet age was starting to ramp up. You had millions upon millions of passengers in airports worldwide. It was a very congested time. And so, in order to alleviate that particular congestion problem, Mr. Juan Trippe, the CEO of Pan American, approached Boeing and told them that he wanted an airplane that was 2.5 times the size of the 707. Now, Pan Am was a very important customer for Boeing, and so they had a lot of sway when it came to developing new technologies, and the 747 was certainly part of that. And so in 1965, the 747 program was essentially started. Boeing was in the process of developing a new super lifter, so essentially what the C-5 Galaxy is today is what they were trying to develop back in the early 60s. Now, Boeing did not win that contract. It went to Lockheed for the C-5, but they used the development and the design from that particular contest, as it were, to begin work on the 747. Boeing took a huge gamble with this airplane when they started developing it, because the idea at the time was that supersonic transports were going to be the way of the future, and Boeing's only recourse was to make this airplane able to carry cargo when that day finally came. Pan Am at the time was all in on the project, and they ordered 25 747-100s at $525 million. That is $3.3 billion today, a humongous sum of money for a brand new, never before tested, never before seen airplane. The early designs of the 747 had a high wing design similar to what would eventually become the C-5 Galaxy. Now this was not used. They instead went with the low wing design with a single deck. Now because Boeing was focusing on making this airplane a cargo airplane in the event that it was not going to be profitable to be a passenger carrier, they put the cockpit up high so that a freight loading door could be used in the nose, which is why the airplane has the hump that it does. It was not clear what that particular hump would be when passenger service would be started, but it would eventually turn into a lounge, and then much later, like in what we see here in this airplane, additional first class seating. One of the things that enabled this airplane to be designed and developed the way it was the advent of new engine technology. What was seen on the 707 and the DC-8 was not going to be enough, and so Pratt & Whitney and Boeing and Pan Am, all three came together to form a new engine specifically for this airplane right here. That engine was the JT9D. It was a high bypass turbofan engine, which was different from the turbojet engines that the 707, DC-8, and likewise used. Any of the airplanes that you see these days that have the big fans on the front of the engines, those are turbofan engines. They're much cleaner, much quieter, much more fuel efficient. They're just better engines overall than these old-fashioned turbojets, which is why you very rarely ever see them these days on modern passenger liners. With the very abbreviated development and testing cycle of the JTD-9 and the 747, major problems did arise, but Boeing did manage to overcome all of them. You had a company that built a brand new factory, one of the largest buildings in the world, still is at the time, designing and building one of the largest passenger airplanes in the world with a brand new engine in 28 months. It honestly shouldn't have happened, but it did. When Pan Am took delivery of their first 747s in January 1970, and on January 21st, 1970, the very first passenger service was scheduled. Now that we've talked about the 747 a little bit, let's move on to talking about Pan American World Airways, or Pan Am, as they were most commonly called. Pan American can trace their origins back to a shell company formed in March 1927 by U.S. Air Corps Majors Hap Arnold, Carl Spaatz, and John Jewett. Their initial concern was that a German-owned Colombian air company, which was SCADTA, or Sociedad Colombo Alemanas de Transportes Aéreos, was gaining influence in Central America. They believed that it was going to pose some kind of threat to the Panama Canal Zone, which may or may not have actually been the case. When the U.S. Postal Service began asking for bids on new airmail routes going into Havana and also into Central America, Pan Am was, of course, on that list. Now, initially, Pan Am was not going to be involved in this particular endeavor because they didn't have the aircraft available to make the particular run, nor do they have landing rights to Havana. But when they realized the SCA-DTA was going to be bidding on this particular route through a company in Delaware, they basically had to act. They ended up partnering with two different companies in order to gain this particular bid. One of them was the ACA, or the Aviation Corporation of the Americas, headed by Mr. Juan Trippe, and the other one was the Atlantic, Gulf, and Caribbean Airways. They were awarded the contract without really any competition at all, and they formally merged in June of 1928. Now, because the government did have fears that SCA-DTA was going to be expanding their operations into Latin America and into North America, they basically gave Pan Am whatever they wanted, and they ended up shielding them from any kind of competition. So for the late 20s and early 30s, Pan Am was essentially subsidized by the US government. Once everything was said and done, Juan Trippe was made the operational head of this new airline, and he wasted no time in expanding the company's operation. By September of 1929, both he and Charles Lindbergh had begun exploring options to expand their operations into South America, starting primarily with Barranquilla, Colombia, which was SCA-DTA's home turf. By the end of the 1920s, they had routes from the U.S. going all the way down the eastern coast of South America. Pan American's initial operations were mainly south of the U.S.-Mexico border. This was mainly because of an agreement that Juan Trippe had with the holding company that would eventually become United Airlines and Boeing and Pratt & Whitney, in order to segregate Pan Am's operations and leave United with the domestic market, or what was the domestic market at the time. This would be the beginning of the era of the Clippers, which is what Pan American has been known for since the very beginning of their existence. These Clippers operated out of Florida, hitting destinations in the Caribbean and down through South America. These Clippers were flying boats that eventually came to symbolize Pan American through the 30s and into the mid-40s thereabouts. They initially started with Consolidated Commodores and Sikorsky S-38s, moving on to S-40s by 1931. Pan American would continue to expand its operations in South and Central America, and eventually would expand across the Pacific in 1934. Going to Hawaii, going to Singapore, and down to Australia, and also other places there in the Pacific. They would also move on to Europe in 1937. Matter of fact, in 1937, Pan American actually won the Collier Trophy, which is usually given to companies and whatnot that make grand achievements in the area of aviation, specifically because of their opening the Pacific to air travelers. Back then, a flight from San Francisco to Singapore would cost roughly $17,000 today, as it would be today. So, indeed, very expensive. But again, this is the time when air travel was essentially a rich person's game. Now, in the 30s, the iconic Boeing 314 became the new Clipper. These are usually what folks associate with Pan Am, aside from the 747. These airplanes were remarkable airplanes. They were wonderful at what they did, and they helped expand Pan Am service in style and comfort through the 30s and into the 40s. After World War II, Pan American used its influence with the U.S. government to shield itself from its competition and to expand as the country's number one or primary international airline, the flag carrier. Some of this drama can be seen if you watch the movie The Aviator with Leonardo DiCaprio playing Howard Hughes, in the scenes regarding him dealing with Senator Brewster in the courtroom. He's talking specifically about things such as that, which is unfortunately what happened back in the day, and that's just the nature of how things were. Through the 40s and the 50s, Pan Am would continue to expand along with its competitors, and then when the jet age finally happened, Pan Am was right there in the thick of all of it. Well, everybody, thank you so much for joining me on today's flight from New York to London on Flight 2, the first ever passenger flight of the 747. I really hope that you did learn something today, at least about Pan Am or about the 747. I know the format today was a little bit different than what you've probably seen in my past videos, and I'm kind of experimenting a little bit with the format, with the spoken words sometimes and the text on screen, trying to see what kind of works best for videos like this. So I appreciate your patience. If you have any advice or any comments or anything like that, please do let me know. I'll be more than happy to take them under consideration and try my best to make the best product I can for you. I recommend a book called Pan Am, an Aviation Legend by Barnaby Conrad III. It talks about Pan Am in great detail. What I discussed here today is a very surface level look at what Pan Am was and its legacy. And it's hard to really understate what they did for commercial aviation all the way up until, well, 1991. We shall certainly see what the next video brings, what the next flight's going to be, what the next time period's going to be. I'll keep working on it, and I hope to see you guys in the next one. Once again, thank you so much for joining me. If you like what I do, please make sure that you like and subscribe. I look forward to reading any and all of your comments, and I really do appreciate your support. From London Heathrow, my name is Saoirse the Vixen. You guys have a good one, and I'll see you later.